Okay, we're going to jump right in. So good afternoon. This is Aaron Burdick, the Senior Director in E3's Integrated System Planning Practice Area. I'm also joined by Senior Partner Arnie Olson, and we also have Mary Winke, who's the Executive Director of the Public Generating Pool with us today. So we are going to jump in right here, and we're going to hand things off to Mary to provide some background, and then Arnie and I will jump in with the presentation. Over to you, Mary.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. Really appreciate the interest in this study. I'm going to be very brief because I know we want to get into the meat of the analysis. But just wanted to provide a quick overview of kind of the genesis of this study, really kind of almost 18 months ago at this point. The PGP members and a group of utilities in the Northwest got together and determined to sponsor this study to have an updated assessment of resource adequacy. In the current time frame, PGP and several utilities in the Northwest did a series of studies in the 2019 timeframe looking at resource adequacy in the Northwest. And these studies really were looking at, hey, you know, a lot of things has changed in 2019. Let's take a fresh look at resource adequacy. How have we done? What have we accomplished since 2019? And that really kind of kickstarted this effort to have a kind of a fresh look at resource adequacy. It also stemmed in part from the events of January 2024, where over that MLK weekend, the region was in pretty tight conditions. So that really kind of also, I think, spurned some interest in refreshing some of the prior studies. So with that, we'll turn it over to E3 to get into the details. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Mary. I'll be taking it from here. I'm Arnie Olson, Senior Partner at E3. Really, I just want to give my thanks to you, Mary, and to all the project sponsors for all the effort that you put into this to help make this project real and bring us to this point. So I'm going to give a brief introduction and sort of talk about some of the high-level findings, and then I'll turn it over to Aaron to walk through really the meat of the study and the findings. So Aaron, why don't you go ahead and go to the next slide. So as Mary said, we were retained by a group of utilities in the region. I think there were 23 different utilities, if I have my count right. They're listed there on the right. And I want to also note and thank the Northwest and Intermountain Power Producer Coalition for their sponsorship and support of the study as well. And it's the first time, I think, that I know of at least, where the utilities and the independent generators have gotten together to sponsor a piece of analysis like this. And I think really just the count of the number of sponsors indicates the concern with which the industry, you know, is looking at the resource adequacy question in the Pacific Northwest region. So our key study questions, we're looking at really what are the near-term resource needs. A previous study that PGP helped sponsor with E3 and others 6 or 7 years ago found pretty significant needs by 2030. And really very little generation has been added in the Northwest since that time frame. So there was a desire to take another look at what needs does the region have in the 2030 and 2035 kind of near-term time frame. And, you know, what are some of the barriers that the industry has been experiencing in developing the resources that are needed to meet those near-term needs? That was really phase one of our study, which was published in September and has been out for a while. But always paired with that was, you know, if we're going to invest in resources in the near term, what's the long-term picture and how durable are those solutions in the near term across a wide range of potential futures, including futures in which the region achieves the clean energy goals that have been legislated in Washington and Oregon and have been adopted voluntarily by a number of other entities throughout the broader Pacific Northwest region. So in this study, we'll be talking about the results of our long-term study. What are some portfolios of resources that meet reliability and clean energy goals all the way out through 2045, including scenarios that achieve very, very deep carbon reductions all the way down to absolute zero. Within that, we asked the question, what is the role of new natural gas peaking capacity, both in the near term and the long term? And I'll talk a little bit about some of our findings there. There's some, you know, very real concerns that if the region were to invest in natural gas capacity to solve a near-term resource adequacy challenge, would those investments become stranded given the policy goals that Washington and Oregon have passed and the way that technology is evolving as well? So that's a very legitimate concern that we wanted to interrogate very closely in this study, and we'll walk through the results of that interrogation. And then lastly, we have now the ability to do studies at a relatively high level of geographical granularity, meaning that we wanted to zero in on particular the constrained load pockets in the Pacific Northwest, especially the area on the west side of the Cascades where it's hardest to get new energy infrastructure into, and understand what needs there might be in those areas now and into the future as load grows due for a variety of reasons. We should go ahead and go to the next slide, Aaron. So this is the geography that we're studying on the left. It's the broader, what we call the greater Northwest region, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and most of Utah and part of Wyoming as well. And we've broken that up into a number of zones. We have 6 zones that we've studied in our modeling. Those we inherited from the West Tech exercise. So if you're familiar with that, we're using the same topology that the West Tech group used. Again, our phase 1 model looks at reliability modeling in the near term. And for phase 2, we extend that reliability modeling all the way out through 2045. And then we evaluate a variety of resource portfolios to help meet all those needs. Go to the next slide. There's a lot here. A lot of assumptions go into a study of this nature, as I'm sure you can imagine. I'll just touch on a couple of the important ones here. And the first one is at the top left. Our load forecasts in the near term are aligned with the forecasts that are produced by the utilities in their integrated resource plans. And then in the long run, we transitioned to a fundamentals-based load forecast from E3 models that are consistent with a long-term trajectory that meets Northwest economy-wide clean energy goals. So they include a significant amount of vehicle electrification and building electrification, which has a pretty big impact on electric loads over a 20-year time period, especially the building electrification, which adds wintertime demand on top of an already wintertime peaking region. We do also have some data center and other large loads included in our long-term forecasts, but I want to emphasize up front that we don't have a massive amount of data center growth. We have a few thousand megawatts in the near term that grows organically over time, but most of our load growth, the vast majority of it, in fact, comes from organic sources of load growth, population growth, economic growth, and then vehicle and building electrification. So that's primarily what our load growth is from. We could have a higher load growth case if we assumed a more aggressive data center build out in our study. Our loss of load modeling considers thousands of simulated years, a lot of years with very cold weather events, very hot weather events, a lot of years with very low hydro conditions, and those are really our big driver of our reliability results. Another point that's worth emphasizing is that models of this nature always assume that megawatts flow from wherever they're needed from wherever they're produced to wherever they're needed, subject to available transmission. And they kind of assume away any real life market barriers for that energy flows to happen. So in effect, the model kind of assumes implicitly that there's a region-wide market where everything flows very smoothly. There are no transaction frictions and no transaction costs. And we know that that's never been the reality in the Northwest, and it probably isn't going to be the reality in the future as we move into a world with 2 different markets operating side by side. So that's just something to keep in mind, that we kind of assume everything happens nice and smoothly, and then the reality will be messier than that. And then lastly, we're at a period with great uncertainty with respect to resource costs. For really all kinds of resources, including gas generation, which is significantly more expensive today than it has been in the recent past. Wind and solar PPA prices are much higher than they've been for a variety of reasons: supply chain, international trade barriers, and repeal of federal tax incentives, and et cetera. So we've taken a very close look at what resource costs are in the near term and over time. And just to note that we have a pretty significant premium on all resource types in the near term, particularly natural gas, which natural gas turbines are very expensive. And we also have taken a look at natural gas delivery infrastructure and added a pretty hefty amount of cost onto new natural gas generation to reflect the need for firm fuel supply. So just so that you have that in mind as you see the results of our study going forward. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So this will be my last slide. That at a high level, our key findings from really the two phases of our study. Number one, that we see accelerated load growth and continued retirements of firm generation in the region, creating a resource gap that, as we've reported before, grows to 9 gigawatts of effective capacity by 2030. But it doesn't stop there. It continues to grow, and it reaches 14 to maybe even 18 gigawatts by 2035, and it grows beyond that. So in our previous study, we had identified 3 gigawatts of resources that are in development. So that closes that near-term gap to 6 gigawatts, but then you see the continued growth and the continued need to add resources even beyond 2030. So, and then we find that in the near term, we really aren't on track to fill that gap. And there's a wide variety of market and institutional and other barriers that have really gotten in the way of the industry in the region. And we've done some qualitative research on the nature of those barriers and what some solutions might be, which we'll report on. In the long run, as we get past those barriers and as we put our institutions in place to develop the resources that we need on the scale that we need, the good news is that it's possible to achieve deep carbon reductions while maintaining the region's reliability and affordability goals. So we chart a future in which the region develops a lot of resources and it meets its resource adequacy standards. It achieves very deep levels of carbon reductions while maintaining affordability and really at a cost that doesn't exceed very much the cost of the least cost portfolio in the region. So I think that's really the good news, is that a portfolio of efficiency, wind, solar, geothermal, transmission, and natural gas is a solid portfolio and a basis for the region to move forward on. We do find that new natural gas peaking capacity is an important part of that portfolio. And we don't come to that conclusion lightly. We take the concerns about potential stranding of assets very seriously. So I think the last thing anybody wants is for the region to invest in a lot of energy infrastructure that is not going to be needed for the long term. So we've really done as careful a job as we could of exploring all of the futures in which this resource might no longer be needed. And we find that it really is a very robust strategy. And the circumstances in which these resources that are built to meet a near-term need become stranded in the long run are very, very narrow and very implausible. And Aaron will have some details to go through to support that finding. And then lastly, we find that there's a growing need for new local delivery capability into the Washington and Oregon kind of core Northwest, but especially into the west side of the Cascades in the I-5 corridor, where the vast majority of the load is located and where new electrification load in particular will add to an existing wintertime peak. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to Aaron to walk you through some of the results. I will note that we have a Q&A panel as well. So if you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A, and I'm going to be monitoring that and calling out as many questions as I can to answer along the way. Then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for a more robust and fulsome Q&A session. So thank you very much for your attendance, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Arnie. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. So the first two findings here, these were presented in the September report that Arnie mentioned earlier, our phase 1 work. So I'll be focused on findings 3, 4, and 5 today in rolling out our phase 2 analysis. So we'll start with the long-term resource needs. So to start this modeling, what we did was we took our near-term reliability tool, our loss of load probability model, and we extended that model out to 2045. So this allows us to characterize how the reliability dynamics of today's system evolve with significant load growth over time. Then we use that model to develop some key inputs into the portfolio optimization tool that tells us how much reliable capacity the region needs and how different resources can contribute to that resource adequacy need in the form of ELCC curves and surfaces. Then we ran our Resolve portfolio optimization tool that takes those reliability inputs. It takes a set of greenhouse gas reduction scenarios, and it produces a portfolio, a least cost portfolio. We then put that back into the reliability tool to validate that that portfolio meets the appropriate level of reliability, resulting in the 1 day and 10-year standard that we used in this study. So one of the really foundational inputs that drives the future resource needs is the load growth scenario. So I'll be showing that here. Arnie noted we benchmarked to the PNUC utility forecast through 2030 and then developed our own fundamentals-based forecasts after that using our pathways tool. So you see the existing and in development resources there in the blue wedge, and then we have the additional resource need, RA need that the region experiences under those two load scenarios. So what we see here, consistent with those numbers that Arnie shared earlier, is a growth of roughly 1,600 megawatts of effective capacity per year, now through 2035. In our reference scenario, with continued electrification trends and legislative policies, we see that same level of growth continue in the long run through 2045. And then in our high load scenario, which includes meeting economy-wide net zero emissions across the region, we see an inflection point around 2035 with a doubling of the annual growth in resource adequacy need. So all of these scenarios have significant load growth, resulting in our roughly 50 gigawatt total resource need today expanding to up to almost 90 gigawatts by 2045. This slide shows the scenarios that we ran. And in designing our scenarios, we focused on three key levers. So the first is policies, the second is loads, and then the third is technologies. For policies, we focus primarily on this 96% greenhouse gas reduction scenario. That will be a lot of the results that I'm presenting today. The reason that we focused on this is that that level of achieved clean energy is consistent with the existing legislated policies in Washington and Oregon, as well as the voluntary utility goals in other states. We also explored a 100% greenhouse gas reduction scenario. So we'll be presenting the results of that today, and then not shown in this table, but we also studied some lower levels of greenhouse gas reduction to trace out the cost curve, and we'll be presenting what that looks like. For loads, we had the reference and the high loads I just mentioned. And then for technologies, we considered three different buckets. One, a mature technology scenario. So this allows for a new solar and wind, battery storage, demand response, geothermal, and new natural gas. We also studied a mature technology scenario where we did not allow any new fossil gas to be built in the region. And then we studied a variety of emerging technology scenarios. So these explore resource options that are not yet commercialized at scale today, but a lot of folks are working hard on to make commercialized in the long run. So this includes multi-day energy storage. It includes new clean baseload resources like nuclear small modular reactors, clean fuels such as hydrogen, as well as gas with carbon capture and storage. So we'll be presenting how those resource options change the needs of the least cost portfolio in the long run. So we developed the costs to go into this model. We're showing those here in two forms. So these are all shown in real dollar terms. And on the left, we're showing the levelized cost of energy for different resources. And then on the right, we're showing the levelized cost of effective capacity. So this is the cost per effective kilowatt year. And what you can see on the left graph is that solar and wind, just looking on an energy basis, are the lowest form of new resource additions. And on the right, you can see natural gas is the lowest cost capacity resource. We also have some of the clean, firm emerging technologies shown there in the dotted lines. So you can see that those are relatively expensive on an energy basis. Some of them compete on a capacity basis. So these are generally sort of high cost, but also high value resource options. So this is a slide from our phase 1 work, and I wanted to ground some of the long-term portfolio additions in this. So this was our analysis of the marginal effective load carrying capabilities, or the marginal reliability contributions of adding different resources today. So what you see here on the top, there are a set of what we call firm capacity resources that can operate essentially on demand continuously. And there are 3 of those, or really 4 of those, that are in the gold coloring. That indicates that they're an emerging technology that's not available at scale today. And then you can see natural gas power plants as the one firm resource that is available as a mature technology today with a 90+% marginal ELCC. Below that, you can see ELCCs for demand response, battery storage, wind and solar. So you can see wind varies by region, but roughly in the 20s to potentially the 30s% marginal ELCC. Solar a bit below that. In the near term, it's actually driven by their energy contribution during the winter cold periods. And that will evolve in the long run as the region becomes less hydro constrained. And then the battery storage is shown there at the bottom. So we found in our phase 1 work that in the near term, batteries have limited value. And this is because of the interaction with the large storage that's inherent within the regional hydro fleet. And the fact that most of our reliability events in the modeling near term are driven by low hydro cold snaps in the winter. And those periods feature energy constraints. So it's the energy that's required, additional energy that's required to address reliability needs. And batteries actually lose energy for what you put in to what you get out. So low value in the near term. We did explore that question further as part of our phase 2 work. So here on this slide, I'll be showing how the marginal ELCCs of storage evolve across the planning horizon that we studied. So this 2030 view is consistent with that last slide. Here, we're not just showing the first increment of new resources, but also how those ELCCs saturate and decline in their marginal value as you add more capacity. In 2035, we start to see the first in marginal ELCC tick up a little bit. This is because as loads are growing significantly and other resources, including new wind and solar and additional firm capacity, are added, the region becomes less hydro dominant, and some of those, the dynamics that we see today become less central. And then in the long run, dependent upon adding a very significant amount of wind and solar capacity. So here we're looking at what the marginal ELCCs are after adding over 100 gigawatts of new wind and solar. You can see those start to tick up quite a bit more, but also still subject to saturation effects. So starting to get into our portfolio results. Starting with the reference load case and a 96% greenhouse gas reduction scenario. So here we're showing the installed capacity across the greater Northwest. You can see the system in 2025 starts around 75 gigawatts of installed capacity, and that increases significantly. Even in this reference load case, through 2045, it's about 100 gigawatts of new resources that are added. And you can see that consists of a combination of wind, solar, and new gas. You can also see the black wedge on the bottom of that chart going away. That is the coal that we allow to retire in the model to meet the greenhouse gas reduction requirements here. And then you start to see storage get picked up but that's not until later in the planning horizon in our modeling, based on some of the dynamics I mentioned earlier. When we look at the generation of the system, you can see that large growth in the blue and orange there from new wind and solar. You see the decline in the fossil generation, so the coal going away, and then the gas replacing it in the near term with associated emissions benefits, and then the gas turning into a very small wedge by 2045 when we're reaching a 96% GHG reduction level. So we see an increase in the gas capacity, but that those plants will operate less and less over time. And they'll really just operate on the days with low hydro and low renewable output. Lastly, so the gray line on the left there, that's the average retail rate. And what we see there is that it is going up fairly significantly from the low rates that the region experiences today. So from around 11 cents to 16 cents per kilowatt hour. And a lot of that growth is actually just driven by the fact that the marginal costs of generation in the region are higher than the embedded costs. And so when you have a situation like that, when you have growth, that's going to increase costs. And that's because new wind, solar, and gas and storage are all higher costs than the embedded costs within the large hydro fleet across the region. I'll note in another couple slides the additional cost to go from a no greenhouse gas policy to this 96% greenhouse gas reduction case are generally quite small. They're around 1 cent per kilowatt hour. So most of that growth is this marginal versus embedded cost difference. Now transitioning to our high load scenario. So here we see essentially more of the same. A portfolio of wind, solar, natural gas, and storage being built out. I should note we also do see a small wedge of geothermal capacity that contributes significantly, or it contributes a portion of the new generation on the right there, given its higher capacity factor. So what we see here is we're going from around 75 gigawatts installed capacity today, all the way to 225 gigawatts by 2045. So really just a massive increase in the size of the power system in the region. These charts show the retail rates across the greenhouse gas scenarios that we modeled, up to 96%. So in the bottom line, the dark line there, you have the no greenhouse gas cap scenario. So we allow the model to build whatever the least cost solution is here without constraining emissions. Even under that scenario, as I mentioned, because of this marginal versus embedded costs, you have a significant rate increase. And then you can see the incremental additional cost to reach the greenhouse gas reduction scenarios modeled is relatively modest with this technology portfolio to reach this level of reduction. So what is not modest is the increase in the amount of new resources that have to be added over time relative to the trends of late. So here, what we took, we used EIA to pull all of the greater Northwest states and the historical capacity additions since the year 2000. So you can see some of the gas after the energy crisis, followed by some wind and solar over the past decade. And what we see is, with the exception of last year, where we started to see a bit of an uptick, the region generally has added only around 1 to maybe 2 gigawatts of capacity a year. And in our long-term projection, that is going to have to significantly increase by quite a bit. So you can see by 2030, we're roughly around the 2025 level, maybe around 3 to 4 gigawatts per year. And then that increases significantly to upwards of 10 plus gigawatts per year of new additions. So this is really sort of a sea change in the level of procurement and the level of build of generation and transmission that the region has experienced over the past quarter century. And that comes with some major challenges and need for institutional reform.
Aaron, I'm going to interrupt you there just for a second. Apologies that we did not have the Q&A working for the first half of the webinar. We were feverishly working on a solution, and I think we've solved it now. So you should be seeing a Q&A little button on your right. There's at the bottom right-hand side of your screen, that's a question mark. So go ahead and start typing in your questions, and we'll be looking at those and collating them and hoping to answer them in the second part of the webinar. So apologies for that.
Okay, we'll continue. So now we'll start to look at the emerging technology scenarios, but still looking at the 96% greenhouse gas reduction level. What we see here in the first three columns, so those are the same from the last chart that I was showing. Here we're looking at the high load scenario. And then we see on the right of that, the emerging technology scenarios that we modeled. So what I'll first point out is the gray line there. What we see at 96% carbon reduction is that there's not a major cost benefit from having these scenarios or these resources available. We do see some of them getting selected in some cases. So particularly the clean fuel CTs, such as new hydrogen combustion turbines, and then varying amounts of new nuclear SMR capacity, depending on the cost. So about 14 gigawatts in our base scenario, up to 19 gigawatts in the low cost scenario, and also a bit of carbon capture and storage being picked up. So those don't have a major impact on the rate impacts. There is a bit of an impact in the low cost scenario, but what they do is avoid a significant amount of solar storage and wind build out. And so you can see, without those, we're adding we get to around 125 gigawatts of solar and wind. When you have nuclear, that could be significantly lower in the range of 50 to 60 gigawatts. So this is the conclusions for emerging technologies at 96% carbon reduction. We'll also be showing how these conclusions change getting to 100%. Before we jump there, I'll just note that point around reducing the amount of wind and solar build out. So you can see that really start to bring down some of the long-term annual additions that I showed on the prior slide. Once we made nuclear available starting in 2040 at scale, we see this decline in the increasing rate of annual additions.
And Aaron, there was a question about the previous version of this slide, which I'll just answer quickly here, which is that it showed both the high growth and the base case growth scenario. The high growth the base growth is in sort of the dark colors, and the sort of faded colors in the back are the additional resources that are added in the high growth scenario. And I'll pick up another one while we're here. There's been some questions about whether energy efficiency was accounted for, or demand response, or virtual power plants. And the answer there is yes. We've embedded into our load forecast a fairly significant amount of energy efficiency, both the type of efficiency the region has been going after in the past. We assume that the regional technical forum type of numbers continue to grow organically as load grows, but then some very significant additional efficiency related to things like advanced, building shells, as part of our deep decarbonization pathways scenarios that form the basis of our long-term load forecasts. So yes, very important for the region to continue investing in energy efficiency, and we've incorporated a significant amount of it into our long-term load growth scenarios.
Great, thanks, Arnie. So now looking at 100% carbon reductions and how the emerging technologies fit into that story. So first thing to look at here is this a very similar chart, but now we're getting to the 100% greenhouse gas reduction level. And what we see is in the no emerging tech cases, in this scenario, the existing as well as any new fossil firm capacity that was added has to retire by 2045. And the resources that are available, mainly the solar, the wind, and the storage at scale, are not effective at replacing that firm capacity. And so you see this massive, really unrealistic level of capacity additions. So now we're talking about over 600 gigawatts of resources We see if we have multi-day storage that can bring down the short duration battery build, but we still need a lot of renewables to be able to charge that storage in the absence of other firm capacity. And then you see the varying emerging technology scenarios. You can see basically anything that is clean and firm will get picked up by the model in these cases. So that could mean a fleet of CTs that instead of burning natural gas are burning a clean fuel like hydrogen or RNG. It could mean having carbon capture and storage on gas plants. It could mean more nuclear. So these all show significant cost benefits versus that one shown in the red circle there, which is really quite large. So that's a tripling of the today's rates nearly. And then you see in this scenario, having the emerging technologies really does help buy down a big part of that cost increase, although not all of it. Another way to view the costs is on this chart here. So we're showing the residential rates in the y-axis and then the GHG reduction on the x-axis. So you see today we're roughly 35% below 1990 emissions with 11-cent rates. If we don't enforce a greenhouse gas target, the emissions increase. Potentially they could even go above 1990 levels under high loads. And there's some costs that come just from all of that growth. And then you see this really flat part of the curve to get to around 80 to 90, maybe even 95% carbon reduction. And then we see this major inflection. You see this potential tripling of today's rates to reach 100% carbon reduction without any firm technologies available. And then we see the emerging technologies being able to buy down a good portion of that. But we do still see that getting from 96 to 100% reduction is potentially going to increase rates by 3 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's still a high cost. And in our technical appendix, we have a slide that shows the marginal abatement costs associated with these levels. And to get to 100%, we're talking about many hundreds to even thousands of dollars per ton. So this slide summarizes the section I just presented. If we make a balanced portfolio available to the model, it can reach very low carbon levels while maintaining reliability and affordability. That's composed of a portfolio of continued energy efficiency, wind, solar, some geothermal, some storage in the long run, as well as new natural gas. The emerging technologies are important at 100%. They're potentially important at 96%, depending on their cost. And then we're talking about a huge amount of resource growth, and that's going to require institutional changes. So the next section is our conclusions around new natural gas capacity.
Aaron, just a couple of quick points in response to questions. So as Aaron noted, all of the cases that he presented met the specified carbon targets that were used as inputs. All the cases resulted in significant rate increases across the region. And that's important to understand. The cost of all new resources is expensive relative to the embedded cost of the existing resources in the region. So growth by requiring investment in new resources does lead to higher rates, and that's true even in the case where we didn't impose any clean energy policy constraints. When we then impose clean energy goals on top of that, rates go up a little bit more, but not by very much. And so that's what we mean when we say that the region can achieve deep carbon reductions while maintaining affordability. Now, it's also important to note that our metric here is a region-wide cent per kilowatt hour average. Some utilities will need to build a lot more than other utilities because they'll have more growth, or they'll have more retirements of existing resources, or maybe their existing resources are more carbon intensive. Those utilities will certainly see higher more rate pressure than the ones who with clean portfolios today and without very much growth. So a lot of that is kind of masked by this region-wide metric that we're showing here. But we think the story is still true for the region as a whole, that deep reductions are achievable at a relatively affordable cost.
So moving on to the next set of cases that we'll show. So in these cases, these are the mature technology cases, but we're disallowing any new natural gas infrastructure. So you can see here the 15 or so gigawatts of firm capacity or firm gas that exists today remains. We see the black wedge on the bottom go away. So this is without any new firm resources, this is a net loss in the firm capacity in the region. And as I noted, the wind, solar, and short duration batteries are not very effective at replacing that firm capacity. So it requires a significant increase in the amount of new resources added. You can see in the gray lines that also comes with a significant cost. And just to put this in scale, so to meet the load growth that we've modeled, so that's the 14 to 18 gigawatts that Arnie noted earlier through 2035, we're talking about 35 to 70 plus gigawatts of batteries. So that's equivalent to 1 to 2 times the existing hydropower fleet across the region. And then that just continues to grow through 2045, trying to scale to meet the level of growth that we modeled with these resources that are less effective at providing RA capacity per megawatt installed. And you can see without the new gas generation, the retail rates increase further by about 3 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Arnie noted we looked across a range of our scenarios at the level of gas that's added. So here we show in dark gray the existing natural gas capacity in the region, and light gray the new resources built on top of that. We have the 96% reduction mature technology case, so that's adding about 10 gigawatts through 2035 and about 20 to 25 gigawatts through 2045. In the emerging technology scenario, we see that if you don't have to reduce all of your carbon, the least cost solution is still to build some new or a significant amount of new gas. Even if a little bit of clean fuels, so that's gas that would burn another fuel such as hydrogen, gets picked up in 2045. When we reduce the cost of the emerging technologies, we see a bit less gas in 2040. So that's because more nuclear is being built. But what we tend to see is that the least cost solution from the model's perspective is to build the nuclear and to build the gas. That the nuclear is really a substitute for the wind and solar, less so the gas. And then in the 100% case with emerging technologies, here we see that the gas is constructed in 2035 and 2040, even if it's forced to retire or convert to zero carbon fuels by 2045. I mentioned this earlier, but drilling into the increase in capacity versus the decrease in utilization. Here on the left, we're showing the coal and gas capacity in the region. So the coal's the dotted line that goes to zero by 2045. The 14 to 25 gigawatts of new gas replaces the firm capacity of that coal, as well as provides firm capacity for the growing loads. Despite all of that growth, you can see the utilization, so the annual capacity factor on the right declines to less than 5%, maybe only around 2% by 2045. So those plants are operated very infrequently, only on the days with very low renewables to be able to provide that backup function and ride through those challenging days or weeks. Another question that we looked at was the need for gas fuel delivery infrastructure. So again, we're talking about a large increase in the installed capacity to provide RA. That's going to require new pipelines for firm fuel supply and or a backup liquid fuel. We did some calculations for how the peak day throughput just for electric generation would increase. You can see those shown in the chart here. So that's roughly a doubling to a more than doubling, depending on the load scenario. And it's important to understand that a lot of the peak growth that drives that, the winter peak growth that drives that need for new firm capacity is associated with electrification of buildings, specifically heat pumps for heating, which become quite inefficient during low temperatures. We're modeling them as having resistance backup here, but an important question for the region to consider is whether that's the socially optimal pathway or whether it would be preferable to keep some of the existing gas infrastructure for local delivery, use that on the really cold periods when the heat pumps are less efficient, and that would avoid the need for new power plants, new bulk pipelines, as well as new electric T&D infrastructure. So that wasn't a core focus of this study, but this is a really important question for the region going forward.
This might be time to address a couple of questions that have come up about gas resource accreditation, especially in light of some of the events that we've seen in the Southeast and on the East Coast, where the gas fleet as a whole performed relatively poorly during these big winter storm, polar vortex type of events. And it's an important question. I think the answer is maybe in two parts. One is that the need for firm fuel in the winter peaking Pacific Northwest has always been understood and incorporated as part of the resource construction. I think that combined with the fact that it's really a vertically integrated utility region where the utilities have constructed a lot of the gas plants that are in place today and generally have invested in some form of, whether it's a firm gas transportation contract or backup supply on site, that we really haven't seen those types of issues in the Northwest like we've seen in the rest of the country. And the fleet is relatively young in the Northwest as well. For most of the Northwest's history, the peaking capacity was provided by the hydro system. And it's only in the last couple of decades that significant amounts of gas have been built out. So those are a couple of reasons why we have seen and expect to continue to see better performance during these winter storm events in the Northwest than we've seen elsewhere in the country. And that's why we've accredited them really highly. But it is an important question, certainly, to monitor going forward. And then there are a couple of questions about batteries as well, and why isn't the region, the system or the model picking batteries sooner than 2040, given these peaking challenges that the region is facing? And I think that goes back to the ELCCs that Aaron presented earlier, which are really relatively low in the near term. Batteries aren't very effective at helping to meet these multi-day cold snap events during low hydro years in the near term, because the event that we see is an energy shortfall, or there isn't any excess energy available to charge the batteries. That does start to change over time as the region's power system outgrows the hydro, and the influence of the hydro is diluted over time. As you double the size of the system and the hydro system stays the same size, you start to see loss of load events occurring because of weather at different times during more average water years, where it's not an energy shortfall, low wind and low solar production. And in those scenarios, batteries are more effective. So we do see batteries being built out later in the modeling period. And then lastly, there were a few questions about the performance of heat pumps and what we're assuming for our peak demand forecasts. And here I want to note that we've tried to make our peak forecasts very closely aligned with the Washington and Oregon energy strategy reports that have come out in the last couple of years, looking at deep decarbonization futures for Washington and Oregon. And those generally have been aligned with the type of deep decarbonization pathways and modeling that E3 does as well. So we are assuming relatively advanced heat pumps are adopted. But those do switch over to a backup heat source and when the temperatures get down below 15, 20 degrees. And so we are seeing a significant increase in electric demand on peak as a result of those heat pumps switching over to electric resistance heat. That's sort of the base technology we've assumed. Now, as Aaron said, there are other technologies available that might help to alleviate that. And then lastly, we have assumed a significant amount of electric vehicle charging management in our peak load forecasts as well. So we aren't just assuming everything happens on peak. We're assuming that there's a significant amount of load flexibility that also occurs in the future to help mitigate that wintertime peak that we're seeing.
Thank you. So we'll continue now to talk about the final section here in terms of the sub-regional resource adequacy needs. Arnie teed up the overall topology that we inherited from West Tech that's shown in the left here. We also, in addition to studying the resource adequacy needs of the greater Northwest footprint, we also looked at two subregions. So the first subregion on the left, bottom left there, is the west of Cascades. So that's the west of Cascades regions in Oregon and Washington. And then we also looked at the Pacific Northwest, which is essentially the states of Oregon and Washington. And in this analysis, looking at subregional needs, we asked the question, is there enough transmission capacity to deliver resources into these regions if the greater Northwest as a whole is reliable? And what we found is that there is today, but that both of these subregions become locally constrained, the Pacific Northwest in 2030 and the West of Cascades region in 2035. What this means is that the existing resource capacity and the existing transmission import capacity are insufficient to address the growing loads by those periods. And so the solution that's required is either new transmission into the region or local resources or a combination. This slide shows how our portfolio optimization model met those. So it met the sub-regional RA needs, and it was met by a combination of transmission and resource solutions. So these sub-regional needs informed the siting of different resources, as well as the interregional transmission build out in our model. So on the left, you see the West of Cascades. There's limited resource potential for new renewables. So we see a bit of that, as well as some additional firm capacity. But we see a large increase in the transmission import capability, particularly by 2045. We're seeing 9,000 megawatts of new import capacity to support those local needs. In the east of Cascades region in the Pacific Northwest, we see, again, that's where a lot of the resource potential is. So a lot of wind and solar is built there, and then a lot of batteries to help integrate those resources and deliver them efficiently over transmission. And then from the inland Northwest and Central West, we see an upgrade of the interregional transmission there of around 4.5 gigawatts by 2045, as well as a significant amount of renewables and firm resources built out, particularly the high capacity factor regions of Montana and Wyoming wind. So we're running a little low on time. I'm going to jump right into our recommendations here. So to start with, I just want to recognize, and Arnie sort of teed this up earlier, that achieving any of the portfolios that we're modeling here for long-term resource needs require some major institutional changes to build out. So on the demand side management side, again, the continuation of historical types of programs for energy efficiency and DR is going to be important, but there's also a need to consider new options for addressing the new types of loads that are growing on the system. So that includes electric vehicles, building electrification, as well as how much and for how long data centers may be able to provide load flexibility. Siting and permitting, again, we're talking about tens of gigawatts, in some scenarios, even over 100 gigawatts of new resources. So that's a huge effort to figure out where those are going to go, to coordinate the generation build out, the transmission build out, as well as interface with local communities. Natural gas requires coordination both for developing new power plants and new pipelines for bulk power, coordinating operations during extreme weather events, as well as thinking about joint planning for retail end uses and local delivery systems in electrifying regions. Emerging technologies need some pathway to commercialize. That's going to be a combination of state utility support, private capital, and potentially federal support. Transmission, this was a highlight of our phase 1 work, noting some of the key gaps in available transmission as a major barrier near term. There are already efforts to reform the interconnection processes and begin a more proactive transmission build out, but the region's behind, and so these will need to continue and expand into the future. And then Arnie noted the need for regional coordination and efficient markets to try to best represent some of the conditions that we see in an optimization model like this, sending efficient signals for entry and efficient signals for dispatch. So I'll quickly walk through our sort of high-level recommendations here. These are all published in our report for you to dig further into. Our phase 1 recommendations are focused on the near-term resource adequacy challenge. So these include considering demand management strategies that can really address the winter resource adequacy need. So this isn't necessarily going to be a 4-hour load shed program, but what sort of response could we expect for multiple days at a time? Firming up imports. This includes thinking about external zones that have excess capacity like California, how those can be secured on a forward basis. Preparing for if that low hydro year does come and load shed is going to be required, how do we minimize the social impact of that, protect human life and essential services, and addressing all of the barriers to resource development that we've noted. In the long run, again, lots of resources to build. We need to continue to address those barriers, think about how to efficiently scale transmission infrastructure to support all of that generation. Number 2 here, there's also a need to consider both the capacity constrained conditions that have driven a lot of the initial planning as RAP has stood up its resource adequacy program and accreditation, to also consider the energy shortfalls associated with the hydro fleet in the Northwest and how those impact resource value. Number 3, think about how to scale up clean firm technologies. Again, this is going to be a combination of potentially ratepayer funding, state funding, private capital, and potentially federal support. Number 4, we noted the need for regional planning efforts to consider sub-regional resource adequacy needs, particularly those west of the Cascades. To think about how this can be met by a combination of transmission, new generation, as well as potentially demand-side management. Number 5, considering, again, a coordinated process for electricity and natural gas. This is both at the bulk grid level, in terms of system planning and operations, as well as thinking about coordination of electrification policies. Then lastly, just the emphasis that we'd like to place on regional coordination and markets. So the West has moved towards markets for energy and capacity, regional and interregional transmission planning. There's also a need to really think about scalable models for clean energy, such that we can achieve these sort of least cost regional solutions instead of each balancing area having to plan its own portfolio on an hourly basis.
So with that, we're at time. My sincere apologies that we didn't get to answer all of the 79 questions that I see in the Q&A queue for now. A lot of questions, and I appreciate them. There's a lot of interest in this study. I know there's a lot of material here. So I hope that the walkthrough of the results was useful. This isn't the last time that you'll hear about this. We'll be out and about in the region at various forums, presenting and answering questions there. Here is my email and Aaron's email address, and you are welcome to reach out to either of us, or ideally both of us, by email with any follow-up questions. There were a lot of great questions in the Q&A, we're up to 84 now, which I wish that we had a chance to get to. I think we should have scheduled our webinar for 3 hours instead of 1.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. I also just wanted to mention before we close, we're going to have another webinar coming up on April 28th on another regional resource adequacy study that we are concluding for the Desert Southwest. So we would invite you all to join that as well.
So my thanks again to Mary and PGP, Puget Sound Energy, and all of the project sponsors again for your interest and your sponsorship of the work. Last word over to you, Mary.
Yeah, thank you, E3, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for the great questions. E3 also did post a technical appendix, so I would encourage you, those of you with detailed questions, to dig into that technical appendix. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention is that the study sponsors also put out a discussion paper, and I think really welcome dialogue with stakeholders and interested entities to really kind of plot a path forward, kind of given some of the daunting nature of some of the challenges we see ahead. So with that, thanks everybody for attending, and thank you for all of your engagement.